You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hello, Melissa. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm really looking forward to having a talk with you today. And if you don't mind, we'll dive straight in.
Sounds good. So glad to be here today.
Yay. So it looks like you grew up in a really active family. I saw a post saying that your great grandmother was skiing into her 80s. I've seen your grandparents chatting about keeping an active life in their, should we whisper, 70s.
And they can whisper in their 70s.
We'll keep it secret. So is that what got you interested initially in moving towards physical therapy as a course of study?
Yeah, I mean, it just had such great role models growing up and being active. We always did stuff as a family, whether we were biking or hiking, skiing, and then playing sports in high school and college. And I was like, okay, I want to do something that's active and help people stay active. And oh my goodness, my grandparents are I call them, like, you guys are freaks of nature. Like, I want to be like you when I get older. They tire me out. So just seeing how you can stay active and healthy and still do all of the things you enjoy as we get older and not be limited by things keeps me going and trying to spread that so other people feel the same. Because usually you hear, oh, I'm getting older, this hurts, I can't do this, I have to stop that. But that's not the case at all.
Yeah, people definitely have some ideas or some misconceptions around aging that definitely don't need to be true. Yeah. And I think physical therapy is a great way to get into the nitty-gritty details of what could be holding people back from living the life that they're excited about.
Yeah, it's just really tuning into listen to your body, kind of blending that physical therapy and yoga background so that you become aware of, all right, well, I feel this a little bit here. Maybe if I make this adjustment or activate that muscle a little differently, or I have to move things a little differently, can make such a big difference in what we're able to do.
Yeah, you've headed right into what I was going to ask you next, which is when did yoga come into the picture, both for you individually as a student and then teaching?
I started practicing yoga with my mom back in college, and we both really enjoyed it. And I was like, okay, I like this. I had the hardest time with Shavasana at the end, which is now my favorite.
You were that person who was fidgeting in Shavasana going, how much longer?
I gotta get going. Yeah. And then we ended up having this one teacher who was like, you should look into being a teacher. And I was like, me? I'm like, I can hardly do half this stuff. Oh, no, I don't think so. And then I thought about it more, and I was actually doing physical therapy school and my yoga teacher training at the same time, and finished the yoga teacher training a year before I graduated from PT school. So pretty much at the same time. Yeah, it was a lot, but it was a lot of fun, and just seeing how the two of them, you can blend them so nicely together and complement each other.
Yeah, I totally see, even just from what you were saying earlier, how the mindfulness and the attentiveness that we cultivate in yoga practice can be a huge lead in to the tools and the solutions that you can find in physical therapy, because you notice all of these little things before they become big things.
Yes. And just the stress relief part while being in school, grad school, was really helpful to have that yoga as an outlet as well, too.
So I guess you didn't get to have the emotional breakdown that so many of us have during teacher training. You were just too busy.
Right. They were there. You were definitely there.
So now that you're established in your career, you have a range of different ways that you work with people, whether that's one-on-one or corporate wellness or programs that you offer on your website. What got you so interested in pelvic health as a sort of area of specialty?
I kept seeing these people over and over again with the same problems.
Mm.
And they would never get that last little 100% there, whether it was nagging back pain or hip pain. And a lot of people will think, oh, well, pelvic health, there has to be something just with my pelvic floor. I have to be leaking or have pain or discomfort there. Where a majority of people I work with, it ends up being an orthopedic issue, whether hip, back, your foot. And then it comes back to that pelvic floor piece and how we're using our core. So I really felt that was the missing link. And after I started taking some more courses in it and just seeing how powerful within 1 or 2 sessions, people were really getting better with lasting results, then I was like, okay, like this is that little missing link everyone should kind of bring attention to if you've got that nagging something that's just not going away.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive more into that in a moment because that was one of my primary questions leading into this conversation. How do we differentiate issues with pelvic health from orthopedic issues? But first, as I was doing my usual super creepy deep dive, ready to talk to you, I noticed that there's a consistent theme through all the materials that you put out on your website and on YouTube and on Instagram. It's really friendly and approachable. It's bright colors. You're really playful. You share little tidbits about yourself that make you feel more approachable than the title of doctor would suggest. And I wondered if that's because the pelvis is a part of the body that a lot of us feel some kind of embarrassment or secrecy about. Is that friendliness part of making that conversation a little bit easier to start?
Yes. So a lot of people don't, it's kind of that hush hush taboo, don't want to talk. Thankfully, lots of attention is coming to this area, and
Mm.
there's more and more information and resources out there for people. But definitely making this environment that people feel comfortable to maybe dive a little deeper into it, or just to know. Biggest thing is just to know that there's help out there. There are resources for you, and you don't just have to struggle quietly or feel like you have to deal with it. Even if you've seen people in the past and have just been brushed off, know that there is help out there for you.
Mm. So I do want to talk about pelvic health in a bit of detail and do a bit of a pelvic health 101 for people. But first, I notice a lot of your activity is on YouTube, and I can see that as being the perfect place for people to sort of make their initial search for something that they might be a little uncomfortable talking about. You've had some pretty impressive success on YouTube. I noticed one of your videos on yoga for constipation relief had 85,000 views. So that's obviously something that really speaks to people that they may not be able to walk into their yoga studio and ask about. So do you have any general tips on YouTube for those of us that are just dipping our toes in the water, for yoga teachers and movement teachers particular?
So for YouTube, oh, I never thought I would be on YouTube, and it's definitely been a journey trying to figure things out. And there's
Mm.
so much still to learn. But first of all, just putting information out there. Think of the questions that people ask you the most, that you get
Mm.
asked over and over again. And that's where I started when I would see a client and I kept hearing the same things. Oh, it's back pain. Okay, let me start doing some more research on this. And then you branch off and do other topics. And the constipation video, that one came from actually a suggestion from one of my clients. And then you can kind of tie that into all your other topics because it's actually a symptom of pelvic floor
Mm.
dysfunction. But I think the first thing is, if you're interested in it, just get started with YouTube. It's a lot of fun. Learning the equipment and the tech side, I have so much help. Let me know if you have questions. I'm happy to like share equipment and stuff that we've been using. My boyfriend's been so helpful with that. But I would just get started with it,
Yeah.
questions that you get asked over and over again. And then you can dive even deeper into looking into topics that are SEO optimized and titling, and then making sure your thumbnails are
Mm.
appealing to people, and just be you, because someone's going to find you for your uniqueness, even if there are other people out there doing the same thing that you're doing.
I love that. I think that's really helpful advice because we can get into our own heads a little bit and think, well, I can't start until I'm perfect. But the idea is
Yeah.
just to give it a try, get started, share information that people are already asking you about that, there's interest about, see where it takes you, and then you can finesse the details from there.
Yes, just get started. I wish I had started sooner.
Yeah, that's great advice. So on to pelvic health. How do we know if we've got a healthy pelvis? Like, how do you define pelvic health?
Having a healthy pelvis is this core system. So when you talk
Mm,
about your pelvic, it's everything that encompasses your core. I used to think of like my core as, oh, I've got these six pack abs that I'm working towards. But your core is your pelvic floor, your diaphragm, your back muscles, your glutes, everything encompassing, and the system has to work together.
mm,
So, having a healthy pelvic floor is this system that works together in unison, making sure you haven't developed habits, whether you're gripping or holding your breath,
mm.
or have a little awareness of like, ooh, that's a little uncomfortable area, or this area is talking to me a little bit more. So that's kind of the idea of having this strong, healthy core system that works together.
So it's not just about there being a lack of pain or a lack of dysfunction. It's about this feeling of kind of integrity or connection in the center of the body, the feeling of you being able to move efficiently, including just
Yes.
breathing by the sounds of it. What's the relationship between the pelvic floor and the respiratory diaphragm?
Yeah. So when we breathe, your diaphragm descends and it goes all the way down to your pelvic floor muscles. And then when you exhale, because of our fascia and our tissues and how everything's connected, when you exhale, the diaphragm comes back up. And then when it's coming up, it's going to pull because of the fascia on the pelvic floor and lower ab muscles. And
Mhm.
that's that gentle contraction that you're feeling and that you want to have. And for one reason or another, whether we sit too much or we're on our devices or we're stressed, I mean, who
Or
hasn't
all of
these
the
days?
above.
That starts to kind of get that system out of whack per se and doesn't quite work like we want it to. And then we start to develop all these types of dysfunctions, or maybe you have pain, or
Mm.
maybe things just don't feel quite right like they used to.
And you've already mentioned some aspects of pelvic dysfunction that surprised me because I thought immediately of things like incontinence and leaking and sexual dysfunction or pelvic pain, but I didn't think so much about hip pain or low back pain or sacral pain. So, what are some of the ways that people could experience pelvic dysfunction?
Yeah, so all the things that you had mentioned, because of our pelvis and the muscles of the pelvic floor
Mm,
and our hip, that's the big connection there. So, one of our hip muscles, your obturator internus, it attaches directly to your pelvic floor. So, if you happen to, for example, stand with your feet turned out, so if they're externally rotated all the time, and maybe you grip your glutes, that's going to pull on those muscles that are on the pelvic floor. And then you're going to feel that tightness feeling. That's
mm,
going to maybe disrupt how you're breathing, how your core system is working, lead to that hip pain that you're feeling if your pelvic floor muscles are tight. And it's trying to figure out, is it the hip that's tight, the pelvic floor, or is it a
mm,
combination of the two of them? So if you feel like you've been doing all of the stretches and all of the core strengthening exercises and going through your practice and this nagging hip pain or back pain just doesn't seem to go away, taking a look at how your pelvic floor is functioning, or just even getting into the breathing, can be really helpful. And that missing link that I had mentioned earlier that I
mm.
see with a lot of my clients that I'm working with.
Yeah, so I was going to ask whether there were some easy ways to differentiate between hip pain or back pain that's orthopedic, that comes from, you know, a movement pattern or an injury or, something going on in the joint versus the pelvic floor. But maybe it's not that straightforward because everything in the body really is interconnected and interdependent.
Everything really is connected. That's why it's
Yeah.
best to seek out some, like, one of your healthcare providers
Mm.
and get help. But it is, if you've tried all of the things and it just, oh, what's that missing piece? Sometimes going back to the pelvic floor can be
Yeah.
helpful.
That makes sense to me. So let's talk about the pelvic floor. How would you describe it to people or explain it to people who don't know much more than just it's the bottom of the pelvis?
Oh, it is
People like me,
important for
for example.
Our pelvic floor is important for so many things. It helps us with our bladder control. It helps support our organs for sexual function, for like orthopedics for our hips and backs, and just provide core stabilization for our area. So if you imagine your pelvis, and it's that kind of bottom sling part of the pelvis where all the muscles come together, but then going so much deeper because we've got our breathing muscle above, and the two of them are like constantly working together. And if they're not rising and falling and we grip or we hold, or our posture's a little different, or even if you're going through your yoga class and you're moving through your yoga class like it's you're lifting 150-pound weights, and we hold and grip. It's kind of looking at our demand of the activity versus our strategy. So trying to kind of match all of these different things. And it's so much more than just, oh, it's just our pelvic floor.
Yeah.
I have leaking and that's what's going on.
And the pelvic floor muscles, please correct me if I'm wrong. We've got superficial, middle, and deep layers. Runs front to back, but also side to side. And we often hear it described as a hammock or a sling, but we could think of it just like the respiratory diaphragm, like a dome shape that sort of lifts up toward the pelvis and then kind of flattens a little bit toward the floor. I love the fact that you associated it with breathing straight away, because something that I see coming up a lot in the information that you share is that many of us are we think our pelvic floor is weak, kind of like we always think our core is weak or our glutes are weak. And so we develop these patterns of gripping our core, gripping our glutes, or overly tensing our pelvic floor. So I love the fact that so much of what you share has to do with learning how to relax. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. And I hear that all the time. Well, I've been doing at the red lights, I do my kegels all the time, and I've been doing them here and they're not really helping. But that's a big thing of the muscles might actually be too tight and the kegels might not be appropriate. Some people, yes, absolutely, they should be doing them, or maybe a combination, but relaxing our pelvic floor muscles is so key, especially when we're stressed. There's lots of stuff going on. If you have jaw pain or neck or shoulder tension, that can lead to more tension in your pelvic floor. The first place I start with anyone is just breathing. And can you connect? Can you even feel those pelvic floor muscles? Do you feel them more in the front? Do you feel them more in the back? Even just now, try to take a breath and send your breath down. Like, are you aware of your pelvic floor area? And the sitting position, posture is a whole nother thing, but sitting is a little bit harder if you have a hard time connecting with your pelvic floor than maybe laying down on your back or laying on your side. It might be easier for you to activate that diaphragm and then connect with the pelvic floor muscles. The inhale, when you breathe in, your diaphragm goes all the way down. You want to feel this softening, this opening or blooming of the pelvic floor muscles. And then the
You've just made sense of a yoga cue that I heard maybe 10 years ago that has disturbed me ever since. It was blossoming instead of blooming, but suddenly that makes sense to me now what they were trying to say. So anyone that I've traumatized by sharing that cue with, you now share the understanding with me. Carry on. Blossoming, softening on the in-breath.
Softening, this opening. And that's the first part, is just connecting with your pelvic floor. I think a lot of times, like you'd mentioned, we go to try to strengthen and hold everything super tight. My core's weak. I've got to do more strengthening of my core. Well, is your core weak? Or are you maybe only utilizing the upper part of it? And do you just have to bring awareness to your deep lower abs and your pelvic floor muscles? And usually when you do that, the strength follows right afterwards. So relaxation is key, first with the breathing, and then just finding some simple, gentle stretches to stretch the pelvic floor out. My all-time favorite. Oh, I love this one. I do this all the time, especially after my runs or workouts.
Yes.
I love elevating your pelvic floor up on a pillow or a block, and then happy baby, just getting into that position and breathing is such a great release for your pelvic floor. So
lying on your back, hips elevated on a block or a cushion, and just that bent knee, knees in toward the torso. Yeah. And just letting everything relax and move with your breathing. I love that. I really do, because I see this a lot with other muscles in the body. If people get stuck in this idea that it should only be one way. I've been told my glutes are weak, so those glutes are on, baby, and they're on 24/7. But none of the muscles in our body are supposed to be on 24/7. They're supposed to work when we need them, relax when we don't need them. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And you also mentioned, which really fascinated me, a link between the pelvic floor and stress, the pelvic floor and the jaw. What's that connection?
Yes, there's several different connections with it, but a lot of it is if you're clenching and like holding your breath and not breathing, that's where the breath comes into the pelvic floor. There's a fascial connection with the pelvic floor and your jaw, and just the stress gripping and holding everything really tight.
So is that linked to the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic
Yes.
nervous? Oh, okay. So that sense of generalized readiness for action, that sense of the pupils dilating, the jaw contracting, blood flow changing from the muscles or to the muscles. So that's part of that whole stress response, which for a lot of us is kind of triggered much of the time, isn't it?
We are on all the time. So just finding the ways with the breathing softens our jaw. We can calm down, get back into that rest and digest phase, and let our muscles soften and relax and get into that recovery mode.
I love that. It really tallies with the things that I know about the other muscles in the body, and how for a lot of people, when they're locked in patterns, learning to relax can be a necessary step in order to learn to engage, or at least learn to engage in the right places or at the right times. I think that's fantastic. One of the things that interested me too in the information that you share on social media is you bust a lot of myths and misconceptions about pelvic floors, about pelvic health. Do you want to talk about some of the ones that you hear coming up the most often?
Yes. So the one is like, I have to have a strong core and I'm going to suck my core in all the time. And could use this with the orthopedic example. You see someone, maybe someone in your yoga class, or maybe it's you've had this back pain all the time, but like because of the pressures of society, or we've just been told for back pain, you have to hold your core in tight all of the time. That increases your intra-abdominal pressure. We're not able to use the diaphragm. It's not going up and down. So the pressure's got to go somewhere, whether it's going to be the hip, your back, some type of pelvic floor issue, whether you're leaking or have heaviness. That holding your abs in all of the time is actually just hurting you. So definitely stop sucking those abs in.
No, I love that. I think that one's really important. And maybe we should explain that relationship a little bit more clearly between the respiratory diaphragm, intra-abdominal pressure, and the pelvic floor for people who maybe don't understand how breathing mechanics work. So could you unpack that for us a little bit to explain why the abdomen shouldn't be tense the whole time?
So the normal breathing, when we inhale, the breath comes down, presses on the pelvic floor. When it comes up, you exhale, lifting it back up. Now, if we suck our abs in, we're holding and we're gripping our abs really tight. So our diaphragm isn't able to go down to those deep lower abs or pelvic floor muscles. So we're creating lots of pressure up in our chest area, and that's pushing that extra pressure down on your pelvic floor muscles and shows up in so many different types of ways.
I think people maybe don't understand how the chest, the abdomen, and the pelvis all kind of work together in sympathy, that breath isn't just something that happens in the lungs and doesn't happen anywhere else, that as the lungs get bigger and descend and they put pressure on the abdominal organs and put pressure on the pelvic organs, there's this very rhythmic give and take. And it isn't supposed to be a static shape and the breath just kind of comes and goes like a little bird in the chest. It's meant to descend and expand and then rebound back up and then descend and expand. But there must be times when we really do need that abdominal support. So how do we know in our life or in our movement practice when we need deliberate abdominal engagement versus when we can relax our abdomen?
So your core is very resilient and automatic, and it kind of knows when it needs to help support your body a little bit more. And it's practicing it, learning to know, okay, I'm about to go and lift 150 pounds. I have to like set my body up, use my breathing strategy versus I'm going to go do some stretching. I need to be in a relaxed mode. I can let my diaphragm go. I can let my abdomen go and just breathe and be with it. So noticing what task you're going to be doing and making sure the effort you're putting in meets your task. And a lot of time, because we're like, let's go, 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 go all the time, we tend to over recruit muscles for the task that we're doing. So a lot of times it's backing off and doing more of the breathing and the relaxation piece, because that core is automatic. When you bend over to pick something up, if it's functioning like it should, it's going to work for you how it wants to work.
I love that. Just that sense of trust in the inherent capacity of our body to meet the demands that life offers. And there can definitely be times when, say, we've been injured or those patterns have been disrupted, that we can learn better mechanics. So there might be a phase for learning that more deliberate engagement and relaxation. But for most of us, if we're not experiencing dysfunction, we can trust that our core knows when it's needed, and when it isn't, we can allow that space to soften and our breath to move through it. So that was the first myth. And I 100% am on board with that one. I love it. We don't need our core all the time. I do remember one of the early yoga classes I went to, the teacher said at the beginning, now engage your core, keep that engaged until the end of class. And I was like, man, 90 minutes. I don't think I can do that. I don't think I've ever had my core on for 90 minutes in my life. It was a very stressful 90 minutes, that's for sure.
Yes, yes.
So what else? What other myths and misconceptions tend to come up a lot?
The other one that I'll see is kind of this posture is another big one that we haven't really talked a
Yeah, let's
whole
dive
lot
into
about.
it.
So your posture just as equally as important as your breathing. You want to make sure that you're setting your pelvic floor up to function optimally and how it wants to. So if we tend to maybe sit back on our heels and let our hips go forward and just kind of hang on our ligaments, maybe we squeeze our glutes a little bit too much, and you might not even, I mean, I definitely did this and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a butt squeezer. Like, oh, I need to stop and relax doing this.
I'm definitely somebody who sags into the front of my hips, but sadly not a butt squeezer, just the lazy sag.
The sag. So it's being aware of your posture. Like, oh, am I leaning too far forward, too far backwards? And okay, I've got to soften. Just so stop squeezing the glutes. Stop kind of, you might even hear the cue sometimes of like tucking your pelvis underneath and just not doing that sometimes, because it's not optimal, especially if you're having some type of dysfunction or pain. They want to set your rib cage up over your pelvis and find that optimal position for you. And you'll just know, because say you're sagging into the hips and you take your breath and you're like, okay, but then you get the rib cage over your pelvis and take another breath in. It should be like, okay, this is my sweet spot. This definitely feels better. It's an easier breath. I can feel my muscles activating how I want, a little differently.
I love that, because I do think people have ideas in their head of what good posture is. And for a lot of people, it has a sort of military connotation of very, very upright and engaged and braced. And you're right. And I can see the tie-in between your yoga practice and your yoga teaching and the physical therapy, because it's the same as Tadasana, looking for that sort of effortless effort, that plumb line to gravity, where you don't even feel as if you need to hold anything in place. It's just there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like that. Even when you maybe just mention posture, people, you see that like, ooh, hold on. I'm like the military. I'm going to sit up nice and tall. But when you do that, so maybe your hips sag, or maybe your butt squeeze, or maybe you like pull your shoulders back. When you pull your shoulders back, and that's going to get your rib cage behind your pelvis so that you're not able to activate it. So it's just being aware of all these different things and cues, and maybe I can relax my shoulders down and back a little bit.
And it is that balance between diligent practice and non-attachment, isn't it? Of being aware of finding that sweet spot where everything stacks, but not holding on to it too tight, not trying to sort of force it into shape, but there being a little bit of ease and a little bit of give and take about it. I love that. So being aware of your posture, looking for that sweet spot, that alignment to gravity, not overly tucking the tail like a sad, scared dog, but giving your body a little bit of space and freedom.
Yeah, there's no good posture, no bad posture. It's finding what works best for you and kind of everything in between.
So what else comes up in terms of myths and misconceptions? I know there's got to be one about kegels because you've mentioned them already.
That was my next one. Yeah.
I knew it was coming.
Kegels will fix all of your problems.
Well, I'm glad that there are plenty of people diligently doing their Kegels at red lights, because there's only 2 red lights in my town. So I'm never doing Kegels. So I'm glad other people are doing them out there for me.
I love it. Your town sounds like my town where I grew up. We had 1 blinking light.
Yeah. So that was your window to do Kegels. I guess you didn't get to do them very often, and you survived okay.
Just kept flying right by. Yeah.
So you mentioned Kegels before, and you said for some people they are important, but they're not, surprise, surprise, they're not the cure-all for everyone all of the time.
Yes. And especially if you've been one, maybe you've heard it, maybe your friends talk about doing Kegels, or maybe your doctors told you to do Kegels and you go home and I'm like, oh, am I doing these Kegels right?
Am I even doing them right? Yeah, that's the classic question, isn't it?
What do I feel? Well, I don't feel anything changing. I've been doing them. Maybe Kegels aren't right for you because, like we mentioned earlier, the pelvic floor muscles might just be too tight. And if you can lengthen them and relax them, sometimes the strength follows. Because if you think of like your bicep, and you constantly holding your bicep like this, you're not going to be able to lengthen through that full range if you're constantly here squeezing.
And it's also not super strong. If you picked up a really heavy weight from that position, it wouldn't feel like you had the capacity to move it around.
No, we want it. So think of your pelvic floor like your bicep. You want your pelvic floor to lengthen, to go through its full range of motion that you're using. And then, yes, some people have pelvic floors that are too tight, some that are too weak, and then some it's a combination of both. And that's where really listening to your body comes into play, seeking a healthcare professional who specializes in this to help along the way. But Kegels are not the end all, be all. And it's looking at function. If you're just sitting at a red light practicing your Kegels, well, what happens when you're up and you squat down, or you're moving through your yoga practice? You want your pelvic floor to be able to adapt and move and change and respond to the different movements you're doing, not just sitting at your red light.
Yeah, it's like a lot of the things that we're discovering in the movement world at the moment, that doing them in isolation in just this one scenario doesn't necessarily translate into real life. Now, you mentioned the happy baby with your hips elevated as one of your favorite ways to get in touch with the pelvic floor and to feel the sympathetic movement that the breath creates there. Do you have any kind of favorite engagement or awakening practices that are like that we could kind of get in touch with that feeling of the muscles lifting?
Absolutely. So the one that I'll often give is, even if you're just listening to this now, you can sitting with, maybe you take a towel roll, or if you sit on an exercise ball underneath your pelvis, and as you're breathing, send your breath. So you're sending it all the way down, and just kind of imagine your pelvic floor muscles softening into the towel or the ball. You'll feel it. You'll get that feedback from the object that's down there. And then as you're exhaling, it's going to come back up, and you want to feel that gentle lifting up. Where are you feeling it? Are you feeling something just upper abs? Are you recruiting those too much? Are you actually feeling it down both in the front and the back of the pelvic floor muscles? Can you feel lower abs? So just sitting and practicing your breathing is a great place to start. And if that is a little tricky, sometimes just laying on your side, you could put a yoga block or a pillow in between your knees And when you exhale, if you squeeze in, you get those adductors kicking on. Sometimes that will help activate the pelvic floor a little bit more. Our muscles like to work together. So sometimes we need a little extra help of, oh, I haven't used this way before. What are some other ways I can recruit these muscles a little better?
That makes a lot of sense to me. And that's a similar way that I work with people with other muscles that they might have kind of lost neuromuscular contact with. Of step one is see if you can generate some tactile feedback from something external so that you can feel the change in pressure or the movement against that external object. And then the other way is what else could you recruit that would get you that part of the body as well? What's the most familiar pathway to you? Is it the adductors on the inner thighs? Is it the core muscles? That makes a lot of sense to me. So kind of giving people an in with whichever way makes the most sense to them and figuring out which one gives you that connection or that feeling and working from there. Great. I love it. Do we have any other myths or misconceptions? What about the whole, as we get older, we're just going to leak a little bit when we jump or run, or, I don't skip rope anymore, or I'm scared of laughing in public.
Oh, yes. Oh, no, that is not normal.
Okay.
It should not happen, even if your friends have the problem, if you've had kids, it's supposed to happen. And actually, like 16% of women have some type of leaking and they haven't had kids before. So it's not just for women who have had babies. So no, it should not, that should not be happening. You want to learn breathing techniques, the posture that we talked about. Do you hold your breath? Do you grip your glutes? What are you doing when you jump or laugh or sneeze? Are you creating too much pressure on your pelvic floor, too much intra-abdominal pressure? And what strategies can we use to decrease that pressure that you're feeling?
Oh, I get you. That suddenly makes sense to me now. Like it is often that forceful exhalation, like the sneeze, that makes people nervous about leakage. But really, when we exhale, the pelvic floor should be lifting, the diaphragm should be lifting. So it's only if we've changed the mechanics around that container in some way, like locking on the abs or locking on the glutes or locking on the back, that there'd be that downward pressure. That makes a lot of sense to me. So people, you deserve better.
Yes, you definitely do. You could try. So it's cough reflex. So if you were to just cough right now, what do you feel? Does your abdomen go out and push down? Do you have leaking? Okay, we'll have to change that strategy. Let me gentle lift up, maybe do a little kegel, maybe lower abs to lift, pull up and in.
Are there any places in yoga practice that you actually cue the pelvic floor, or is most of your work with this more gentle awareness around its natural function?
A lot of it's more just gentle awareness, trying to kind of more general body awareness. How are you moving? What are you feeling? That connection. Because a lot of people are like, well, I don't feel this. I can't feel my lower abs. Oh, I do glutes all of the time, but I never feel them turn on. So just showing them little different tweaks that they can make throughout different movements that can help get them activating those muscles. Or maybe we go a roundabout way of it. If we're practicing breathing and they can't feel their pelvic floor, maybe we'll do some trunk rotation to help open up our rib cage so that it's easier to breathe that way. And then they can feel that connection. So kind of more a roundabout way of getting there.
So there aren't specific poses where you would be talking about Mula Bandha to get people to switch their pelvic floor on or to lift it up, or
Yeah, sometimes yes, but I'm careful with that cueing because some people, if they already have a tight pelvic floor, that might just increase their tightness in that area. So I might cue with a different type of breathing versus kind of a really big, deep lifting up, unless I really knew, okay, they know how to do this and they're not having too tight of a pelvic floor.
So it's like every cue in yoga always, there's no such thing as the perfect cue. It all depends on who you are talking to and what their starting point is. That makes a lot of sense to me.
The biggest thing is just connection. What are you feeling when you're moving? And how do we change things so that you feel it where you need to?
That makes a lot of sense to me. Any other myths or misconceptions that you feel called to bust?
Ooh, I'm sure there are so many more out there. Those are the big ones that I
Hmm.
see over and over again with people.
Yeah. And there's this really common pattern, isn't there, of people who are well intentioned and well educated feeling like, I got to switch that thing on. I've got to make that thing strong. I've got to engage that thing, and not
Yeah.
understanding that there's a flip side to that, that for there to be strength and engagement, there needs to be softness and relaxation and release as well.
Yes. It's a balancing act.
Like everything, the sthira and the sukha, everything is a balancing act. And it all, by the sounds of things, starts with awareness, with its figuring out what we can actually feel. And if we can't feel much, gathering some external tactile feedback or getting some other muscles to recruit. The last tool that I tend to use with people is palpation, which I'm not going to recommend to anyone when it comes to the pelvic floor, but I'm sure is something you can use in the privacy of your own home.
Definitely can. There's definitely even like external releases for pelvic floor muscles that are great, especially when you have that pelvic floor that is just so tight and not. So
Mm.
there's definitely some to do.
Yeah. Maybe that you see a trained professional for.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you shared with us your Rewire Pelvic Floor playbook that we'll link to in the show notes to give people some starting tips or some practices that they can play with. And you're also going to be teaching on yoga medicine online, and you'll do a guest lecture as well to help educate people a little bit about pelvic health and the pelvic floor. Any little tidbits that you want to share to get people excited who haven't logged on to hear that yet?
Oh, well, nothing that I haven't talked about here. I'm just excited to see you there and come join me.
Yeah, it's a great platform, yoga medicine online, and it's I'm going to edit that out later because I've totally lost my train of thought.
I do it
Have
all
you
the time.
recorded your classes or your lecture yet?
I've started to, yes, yeah. So I
Okay.
can actually, we can do a do-over on my tidbits if you want to go
Okay.
back.
Let's do a do-over. Great. So we have you, yeah. Thank God for editing and do-overs. So the good news is we have you coming up as a guest teacher on yoga medicine online. So if there's anything that you've said that's kind of piqued people's interest and leads them to want to explore a little bit, you'll be offering some classes on yoga medicine online, as well as a guest lecture that talks a bit about pelvic health and the pelvic floor. So any little tidbits that you'd like to share to get people excited about that?
Yes. So as we've been talking, how everything's connected, we dove a little bit into the posture, but I get into how our feet, what is
Mm.
going on in your feet and how that connects with your pelvic floor, and little tips that can help build a strong pelvic floor that way. We go over deep core connections. I get into hip mobility in there as well. So I can't wait to see you there.
That's exciting. That sounds like stuff that I would actually be willing to do. So I'm looking forward to it. I love starting with the feet because you've got to find your in, haven't you? And if for you it's the core or the glutes or the rotators or the adductors, or for you it's the breath, or for you it's the feet, it sounds like there's a pathway to get you a little more connected to the pelvic floor. Anything else that I haven't asked you yet that you feel like you want to share?
You did such a great job covering it all.
Thank you. I'll take it. We've talked about, we haven't actually really talked about this exclusively with gender, but often this is something that comes up more for a topic that's associated with women or those that identify as female. Everybody has a pelvic floor, obviously, and everyone needs to have a healthy pelvis. But for those of you who do work with a lot of people who identify as women, you might be interested in checking out the yoga medicine female health training, which doesn't dive in detail into the pelvic floor, but talks about a lot of things around the reproductive cycle, around hormones, periods, menopause, all of the things that kind of punctuate the female life cycle. So if you're listening from that perspective, then do check out the yoga medicine female health training. But let's talk for a moment about pelvic floor and people who identify as male. Does the health or dysfunction show any differently in that population?
It's pretty similar. Like you said,
Mm.
everyone has a pelvic floor, and it's same thing I find a lot of times is the muscle tightness.
Mm.
Maybe they have an overactive bladder and they're constantly running to the bathroom and like, what's going on? Like, why I'm younger, I'm not older. Why is this happening? Maybe you lift lots of weights and that pelvic floor muscle gets really tight. So the breathing, the stretching comes into play. It can show up as back pain, constipation, different digestive issues. So everyone has a pelvic floor. It's not just for women, and learning to connect with it is equally as helpful for everybody.
I love that. I think you've given some really beautiful concepts for people to play with, especially people like me who I try not to think about the pelvis. I try not to think about the pelvic floor, but the way that you've explained it today really speaks to me, because you've explained it in a way that parallels all of the other parts of the body, that when they're functioning, they work without us needing to really think about them or overly engage them. And we can sometimes get stuck into patterns of dysfunction that mean that we need to re-educate ourselves. But for all of us, for always, there is this need for balance, for effort and ease, for strength and softness. And it all starts with us being more aware of where we're at right now. I really appreciate your time, and I love all the tips that you've shared with us. For people who are intrigued and want to know more, other than Yoga Medicine Online, where would you send them to?
Oh, I'm over at YouTube quite a bit. YouTube, it is MSunn Yoga and Wellness. And then I'm also on Instagram as Dr. Melissa Oleson. So please reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. And thank you so much for having me.
It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.